The first thing I remember is the sound, not the crackle of fire that would soon consume every wall I had known, but the shattering scream of timber giving way, a voice too deep to belong to wood, splitting through the night as if the earth itself had decided to howl. I stumbled barefoot into the yard, the cold dirt biting my soles while heat pressed against my skin, and in the sudden blast of orange light I saw the cabin, our home, burning from its very bones outward. The windows gaped like eyes, glass already sagging from heat, smoke pouring into the dawn, carrying with it the scent of pine sap, scorched wool, and the memory of every prayer ever spoken beneath that roof. I called for Silas, my brother, my last blood in this wilderness, but my cry was swallowed by the wind and the roar of flames, a voice too greedy to give anything back. Through the haze I caught sight of him, Clara Wynn, my brother of 16 years, his wrists bound with rope, his small frame thrown like spoil over the back of a dark horse. He twisted once, his eyes wild, trying to call to me, but the gag turned his words to nothing but a muffled moan. Behind him rode men I did not know, yet their cruelty needed no introduction. At their head was one I would learn to fear, Harlan Creed, his posture rigid, his coat flaring with the wind, a figure both controlled and merciless. Behind him, Cole Varick turned in his saddle, his smile catching the firelight as if cruelty could glow, and he raised his rifle in mock salute before vanishing into the smoke. I tried to run, tried to reach them, but the flames curled from the walls and drove me back with such heat that my skin blistered near the edges of my gown. The fire was no longer content with the cabin alone. It reached for me as if my grief had made me flammable. Sparks stung my arms, ash clung to my hair, and the smell of burning resin carried memories of our father cutting logs for this house, hands raw from work, eyes proud that we had carved safety from wild land. I saw those memories turn to cinders before me, and the weight of helplessness collapsed inside my chest like the very roof timbers that fell inward with a scream. I called Silas's name again, louder, breaking my throat. But the only answer was the echo of hooves fading into the horizon, a sound that hollowed the silence behind it. When the fire began to wane, when the roof had already fallen and the walls leaned like drunks about to collapse, I staggered forward and dropped to my knees in the ash. The ground was hot, splinters of charred wood still breathing smoke. My hands sifted through the wreckage, desperate, aimless, clawing for anything the fire had not claimed. At last my fingers closed around cloth, half-burned, the color still visible, a strip of Silas's scarf, one he wore each morning when chores began, frayed at the edges from too many winters. I clutched it to my chest as if the fabric itself still held his warmth, my tears cutting tracks, through the soot on my cheeks. It was then that the weight of what had happened fell over me like the smoke settling across the valley. Silas was gone, stolen not by fate but by men, and I had been left behind in a grave of timber and ash. For a time I could not move. I pressed the scarf to my face, breathing in the smoke and the faint ghost of his scent, trying to believe that if I stayed kneeling long enough, the fire might give him back, that perhaps I had missed him, that perhaps he still hid somewhere among the ruins. Yet deep down I knew the truth. The riders had carried him beyond my reach, and I was as useless as the burnt bones of the house behind me. I whispered prayers, not knowing whether I was begging for his life or my strength, not knowing whether heaven could hear me through the smoke that clogged my lungs. But prayers did not still the wind, and prayers did not erase the feeling that I was not alone. Even as I knelt in the ashes, clutching my brother's scarf, I felt it, the weight of eyes fixed on me from beyond the tree line. The forest was quiet, too quiet for dawn. The birds hushed, as though they too waited for something to move. My breath caught as I looked up, and through the smoke-hung veil of morning I saw it, a figure standing among the pines, still as stone, watching. The firelight painted no detail across his face, only the outline of a man cloaked in shadow, tall, unmoving, as if carved from the land itself. For one heartbeat I thought it might be one of Creed's men come to finish the work, and my hand gripped the charred scarf tighter, ready to defend myself with nothing but fabric and fury. Yet the figure did not advance. He remained at the border between ruin and wilderness, silent, patient, watching with a calm that unnerved me more than if he had charged. My heart pounded so loudly I thought the trees must hear it. I whispered Silas's name again, softer this time, as though the figure might deliver the echo back to me. But no sound came, only the hiss of dying embers and the sigh of wind moving through pine. My throat burned with questions. Was this a savior, a scavenger, or something worse? Why watch me instead of vanishing with the rest? What did he see in me, alone in ash, that kept him rooted to that spot? I rose slowly, every muscle stiff with dread, my eyes fixed on the shape at the tree line. The morning light brightened just enough to touch his outline, to reveal the faint gleam of a feather tied in his braid. And in that instant, I knew this was no settler, no raider, but something else entirely. My heart stumbled between fear and desperate hope. The fire had stolen my brother, but the shadow in the trees promised a path I could not yet name. And as the last beam of firelight licked the ruins of my home, I felt the first pull of a story that would not end in ashes, but in a bargain whispered by a stranger whose presence at the edge of the trees would haunt me long after the fire was gone. The rope bit so deep into my wrists that the pulse in my hands turned to fire, and every stumble yanked the knot tighter until I could feel each twist like teeth. I tried to keep my footing in the churned sand of the wagon track, but the horses set a pace meant for men with free legs, and I was not such a man, not anymore, only a body dragged forward by fear and dust and the promise that if I fell again, they'd let the hooves teach me obedience. The gag tasted of stale leather and sweat and something sour that made me fight the urge to retch, and when I lifted my head for air, the morning rose around us in a white blaze, the sun already hard, the sky a basin beaten thin, and all I could see of my sister's world, the world I had left burning, was a smear of smoke lying low on the horizon like a wound that refused to clot. I told myself not to look back, because to look was to break, and breaking would make me a noise they'd enjoy. So I fixed my eyes on the tail of the lead horse and counted the braid of its hair, counted until the number lost meaning and became a rhythm that carried me where my legs could not. Their voices moved above me with the loose confidence of men who believed the land itself worked for them. When Harlan Creed spoke, the others fell quiet, not because he shouted, I never heard him raise his voice, but because even the wind seemed to carry his words with care, as if it feared misplacing them. He rode a black horse that scarcely seemed to touch ground, his coat long and unwrinkled despite the heat, his hat brim casting a clean edge of shadow across a face I could not fully see. Yet I felt the shape of his attention whenever it turned, a cold blade passing over my skin. Cole Varick rode 3 places back and made a sport of me. He would nudge his mount close enough for gravel to kick into my eyes, and then lean down with that narrow grin that looked stamped rather than grown, and whisper thoughts about how boys who cry taste saltier to coyotes. And I learned to keep my tears somewhere the sun couldn't find them. They spoke of delivery and numbers and the fort, the way ranchers talk weights and fence lines. Once Cole asked how much a win fetched if the name was still warm from a fire, and men laughed, and I swallowed blood where I had bitten my cheek, because rage is a kind of thirst that will drink anything. We did not ride the open road. Creed kept to the folds of the land the way a river knows its bed, slipping between low coulees and along dry creek banks, where the cottonwoods made a whisper that masked our noise. Every few miles he'd lift a hand, and the whole line would slow, as if the gesture tugged invisible reins. And he would listen, head tilted, not to us but to the country itself, and when he was satisfied, he would nod, and we would move again. I realized with a sick kind of awe that he trusted the silence more than any scout, and the silence seemed to answer him. Once we passed a charred circle of ground, no wider than a wagon, and the men went still for half a minute, hats off, not in respect but in inventory, and I knew in my bones that what they carried was not simply me, nor the coin I might be traded for, but the proof that a place could be taught a lesson if spoken to with enough fire. The dust climbed into my throat until it felt like I was breathing sand. My shoulders burned from the rope that tied me to a saddle horn, and when the horse lifted its pace, I had to half run, half fall, my boots catching on roots, my knees opening again and again, the blood drying to a crust that cracked each time I bent. I tried to think only of one thing at a time. A cup of water, a slice of shade, the corner of Clara's apron where she wiped her hands after skimming milk. the way she would frown when I ran too fast with a pail and slopped precious work across the yard. And in the thinking, I felt a steadiness that wasn't strength, but a kind of quiet that kept me from making the sound they wanted. When noon hammered down on the back of my neck, Creed raised a hand and we stopped in a pocket of cottonwoods beside a trickle of water that tasted of iron. They loosened the rope enough for me to kneel but not stand, and Cole tipped a dipper so the stream ran past my lips without touching, grinning as if he'd told a clever joke, until another man pushed his arm and said to knock it off if he wanted Creed's patience at supper. I heard names while we rested, names that slid across the water as if the creek were learning a new language. Blackwell at the fort, expecting a lot. Nolan on the North Trail, who'd traded a boy for Winchester shells, a preacher who blessed a herd of mules and the men who stole them. None of it made sense to me except the shape of it, and the shape was simple. Men were coin when men were useful, and trouble when they were not. And I had to learn which kind I was before the choice was made for me. A woman's laugh sounded from the far side of the trees and then stopped. Not because she had finished, but the way a hand finishes a fly. I had the unsteady thought that the country itself held its breath whenever Creed walked through it, as if waiting to see what shape he'd teach it next. When we moved again, the land opened into a broad basin where the light lay flat as a blade, and for the first time since leaving the ash of home, I let my eyes climb the line of hills to our left. High on a ridge, something darker than rock cut a thin angle against the sky. Too straight to be bush, too still to be bird. And as the horse pulled me past a break in the brush, I saw that it was a man on foot, narrow as a pine, standing where the land makes the wind choose. And he did not wave or shout or hide, only watched with a patience that made the hair along my forearms prick as if a storm had stepped into my shirt. I blinked hard and he was still there. Cole followed my glance and shaded his eyes, then cursed softly when he saw nothing, and I realized I had not given us away. The man on the ridge had not come for the riders. He had come for me. I held that knowledge like a hot stone in my mouth, not daring to turn again, because some thread between us had stretched tight, and I feared to pluck it with my eyes. Yet even as I looked down to save it, I felt the weight of his regard like a hand steadying my spine. It was not the way a bounty man looks at a prize, nor the way a preacher looks at a soul. There was no ledger in it. It was a measuring, a question, and the question made my chest ache because it felt like the first thing all day that had belonged to me. A gust crossed the basin, and the dust lifted, and for a breath the rope slackened. I thought of running, and then I thought of hooves, and I did not run. Late in the day, the country pulled itself into shallow rises, and we came upon a clump of junipers, marked with a sign I did not at first recognize. 3 slashes cut into the bark where they met, clean and deliberate, older than the morning, but not old enough to have healed, and 2 men muttered that someone had left word. Creed dismounted, touched the cuts with 2 fingers, as if they were a scripture he did not have to read aloud, and nodded once. I could not tell whether the sign welcomed him or warned him, only that he had expected it, and that expectation chilled me more than any threat would have. He swung back into the saddle and said the fort would be glad, and the word glad coming from his mouth sounded like a locked door. When the sun fell, we made a cold camp in the lee of a low butte where the wind could not find us. They tied me to a mesquite root and left me with a canteen that smelled of tin and horse, and when I tipped it, the water hit my throat like a truth I wasn't ready to swallow. I lay on the dirt and told my heart to beat slower, because panic is a fire that eats the air from the inside, and while I lay there, fighting my own chest, a pebble clicked near my ear. I turned so slowly it felt like learning a new body, and the shadow of a man kneeling rose out of the scrub so close I could smell him, smoke and sage and something wild that didn't live in saddles. And though I could barely see his face, I saw the long braid along his shoulder and the quiet in his posture, and knew he was not Creed's. He did not touch the rope. He did not draw a blade. He leaned so his breath moved the hair near my temple, and, in a voice low enough that the dirt itself had to carry it to me, he said 2 words that opened my chest wider than fear had. Stay awake. He was gone before the rope could remember to pull at my wrists, and in the space he left I heard the horses shift, the men turn in their blankets, Cole Varick snore as if greed required effort, and above all these small noises the steady hush of the dark doing its work. I kept my eyes open until the stars learned my name, because a stranger had asked it of me, and because somewhere beyond the butte, a ridge waited for morning, and a watcher waited for a chance I could not yet see. The fire had done its work and left me in a silence that did not belong to dawn. I knelt in the ruins of our cabin, with Silas's scarf clenched in my fist, the ash still warm beneath my knees, the air still stinking of pitch and singed cloth. The world that had been ours, the neat rows of cut wood, the jars of preserves my mother once lined on a shelf, the hearth where Silas laughed when he burned bread, all of it was gone in a single night, replaced with smoke curling low across the ground, like a veil that refused to lift. I told myself not to cry because tears wasted water, and water was what I would soon need. But the grief burned hotter than the embers, and I bowed my head until the scarf was wet enough to turn ash into streaks across my face. The smoke shifted with the wind, and for a moment I thought I heard footsteps behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Only the stumps at the edge of the yard where my father had once promised to build a fence that never came. I should have been planning, deciding whether to follow the trail of hooves or crawl to the nearest settlement. But my mind circled the same thought. Silas had cried out for me, and I had not reached him. I could still hear it under the roar of the fire, muffled by the gag they shoved in his mouth, desperate, helpless, fading into the distance while I screamed into the smoke. That sound would live in me longer than any scar. When I rose, my body stiff, I walked to the tree line because standing in the ruins made me feel like the dead waiting for burial. The woods loomed dark, branches rattling with a voice like bones, and I wondered if I was already too weak to take even one step into them. Yet as I stood at the edge, the air shifted again. Not the casual brush of wind, but something deliberate, heavy, a presence choosing to be felt. My heart quickened. My eyes searched the gloom, and then I saw him. He stood a few paces inside the shadow of the pines, tall and lean, still as if the roots had grown through his boots. His hair was braided long, the faint gleam of a feather tied near the end. His shoulders carried a hide cloak stained darker than bark, and the way the light broke across him made his outline blur until I thought he might vanish if I blinked. I had heard stories, every settler child had, of Lakota scouts moving through forests unseen, their eyes sharper than hawks, their knives quicker than snakes. To see one so near was to wonder if he had been watching me all night, measuring my sorrow, judging my worth. My first thought was fear. My second was shame, because I knew without doubt that the men who burned our home would have told their own stories about Lakota raids, and I had swallowed those stories as if they were gospel. Now one of those shadows had stepped into the morning to face me, and I did not know whether he came as enemy, witness, or something worse. I took a step back, clutching Silas's scarf, as if cloth could stop a knife. The silence between us deepened until it pressed against my chest. He moved at last, slow, careful, lowering one hand toward his belt where I expected a weapon. My breath locked in my throat. But instead of steel, he lifted a strip of dried meat wrapped in cloth and laid it gently on a flat rock between us. Then he straightened, his eyes never leaving mine, calm, unreadable, patient as stone. I could not speak. My lips moved, but no sound came, and in the end it was he who broke the silence, his voice low, a whisper that seemed to carry more weight than shouting. "You're free." 2 words only, but they struck me harder than the heat of the fire. Free? My brother was gone, my home reduced to ash, my future nothing but dust in the wind. What freedom could there be in that? The question filled my mouth before I could stop it, but I did not speak it aloud. Instead, I stared at him, waiting, hoping he would explain, but he said nothing more. His eyes flicked toward the horizon where the riders had vanished, then back to me, and I understood. He had seen what happened. He knew where they went. The realization shook me to my core. If he had seen, then he had chosen not to intervene. If he had followed, then he had chosen to remain hidden. Was I meant to trust a man who had let Silas be taken? My heart burned with the contradiction. Faith pulling me one way, desperation pulling me another. I thought of my mother's Bible, now ash beneath the ruins, and wondered if God worked through strangers like this, or if I was being led into deeper sin. I bent to the rock, my hand hovering over the food he had left, torn between hunger and pride. The smell reached me, smoke-cured meat, sharp and clean, and my stomach twisted with need. Still I hesitated, because taking it meant more than filling my belly. It meant stepping across a line drawn in fire and blood. At last I snatched it and pressed it to my lips, the salt and smoke burning my tongue, and in that moment I felt as if I had swallowed not just food, but the beginning of something I could not turn back from. When I lifted my eyes, he was still there, still silent, still measuring. The words, "You're free," echoed in my mind, but I could not decide if they were promise or warning. The forest seemed to darken around him, as though the trees themselves bent closer to hear. And just before the wind shifted again, I had the wild thought that perhaps freedom was not what I had lost in the fire, but what I had yet to pay for. The smoke of my ruined cabin still clung to my hair and dress as I followed him into the trees. Every step a betrayal of the life I had been taught to trust. His stride was long but measured, not the hurried pace of a fugitive, nor the swagger of a raider. It was the pace of someone who had walked the land so long it bent to his rhythm. I held Silas's scarf close, pressing it into my palm until the fabric cut grooves in my skin, a talisman, against the strangeness of what I was doing. The ground was soft with needles, the air damp with the scent of sap and earth, and though I had lived beside this forest for years, it had never felt so alive, as if it recognized him and weighed me as an intruder. We stopped in a hollow where stones formed a natural ring. He crouched to build a fire, movement spare and practiced, striking flint with a calm that made me ache with envy. The small flame grew in silence until smoke curled upward, pale gray against the dark boughs. He did not look at me as he worked. Instead, he laid herbs into the flames, and the air filled with a bitter, sharp smell that caught in my throat. My instinct told me it was witchcraft, something forbidden, but my hunger told me to keep watching, to stay near the fire, even as my faith scolded me for it. At last he spoke, his voice so low I had to lean forward to catch the words. "Your brother is not lost to strangers," he said. "He is taken by men who trade faces as easily as they trade cattle. They sell what breathes, and they sell to men who wear your tongue." The words pierced me more deeply than the smoke, and I shook my head. "No," I whispered, clinging to the lies I had grown on. "Settlers do not burn their neighbors' homes. Settlers do not sell children." My voice broke as I said it, because I remembered Cole Varick's mocking grin, the way he had saluted me before vanishing with Silas. The scout looked up then, his eyes sharp in the firelight, the flames dancing in their reflection. "Belief will not bring him back," he said, "but smoke carries truth." He pointed to the trees beyond, where faint black threads drifted upward into the dawn. "That is the trail of Creed. He makes no camp without fire. He wants to be seen because he believes no one dares follow." The name stung, though I had not known it until now. Harlan Creed, the man who stole my brother. The scout spat the name as if it were poison. He traded once with my people, promises for rifles. He broke those promises. He burns what he cannot keep. My knees weakened, and I sank onto a stone, the scarf still tight in my hands. I wanted to believe this man was lying, because lies are easier than new truths, but every word rang with a weight I could not ignore. The stories of Lakota raids I had been told since childhood felt pale now compared to this, as though the danger had always been inside our fences, waiting for fire to loosen its grip. I stared into the smoke rising from the fire, watching it twist into shapes that seemed almost to speak, and a part of me longed for it to deliver a sign, anything to ease the sharpness of the choice before me. He pushed a strip of food toward me across the stone, the same offering he had made in the clearing, but this time I did not hesitate. Hunger was stronger than pride. The meat was salted, tough, strange on my tongue, and yet it steadied me in a way prayer had not. My father's Bible was gone, burned with the house, and the silence of heaven weighed heavy as stone. Here was something tangible, a flame, food, a man who claimed to know where my brother was. Was this not an answer, even if it came in a form I feared? "You want him back," the scout said. It was not a question. I nodded, the words too sharp in my throat to speak. "Then you must walk with me, but know this, my path is not your preacher's. The land I walk does not forgive lies, and it does not bend for prayers. If you follow in truth only." His gaze held mine across the fire, and in that moment I felt more seen than I had in my life. It frightened me that a stranger who owed me nothing could read me so easily Yet it also filled me with a faint, dangerous hope. The smoke curled between us, carrying the scent of sage and resin, rising like a signal to the sky. He traced a shape in the dirt with a stick, a spiral marked with 3 slashes. "This is Creed's mark. I have seen it carved into trees, into stone. It tells his men where to ride, where to meet, where to trade. If you follow me, you follow into his shadow." The thought made my chest clench, but when I looked down at the scarf in my lap, I knew there was no other choice. The fire popped, sending a burst of sparks into the air, and I flinched. He did not. His voice softened to almost a whisper. "Creed believes your brother is already gone. That is his mistake. But if you walk my road, you must learn to be silent. You must learn to move as shadow. And you must understand, freedom does not come as gift. It comes as bargain." I stared into the flames until my eyes burned. I thought of Silas tied to a saddle, his eyes wild as the fire consumed our home. I thought of the men's laughter, of Cole's rifle gleaming in the dawn. I thought of the scarf in my hand, the last thread connecting me to my brother. I lifted my gaze to the scout and forced my voice through the smoke. "I will walk with you." "For him?" He nodded once. No smile, no triumph, only acceptance, as if my choice had been inevitable. The fire guttered low, the smoke thinning, and he scattered the ashes with a swift hand. "Then take your last breath as settler's daughter," he said. "The next you draw will be in shadow." The smoke rose one final time, curling toward the treetops, and as it faded, I realized the fire had taken more than wood. It had taken my innocence. Ahead lay only shadow, and a bargain I did not yet understand. The rope rubbed my wrists raw until every breath felt soaked with fire, and though my body begged for rest, the men who held me gave no pause beyond what their horses required. We had ridden until the sky broke from blue to copper, and at last they dragged me into a canyon, where smoke already curled between the walls. The place smelled of iron, of hides stretched too long in the sun, of meat burned low on a spit, but beneath it all was the heavy stench of blood that clung to rock and soil, as if the earth itself had been asked to drink more than it could hold. They tied me to a post at the edge of their fire, not far from where the canyon narrowed into a crooked pass. The flames cast the walls in shifting shapes, red giants leaning closer to watch me suffer. My knees sank into grit, each grain sharper than glass against torn skin, and I tried to lift my chin, though my body trembled with the effort. Creed sat near the fire, his long coat stretched around him like a shadow given flesh. He said little, only nodding when his men spoke, as though words wasted more than they earned. Cole Varick stood close enough that his grin cut against the glow, his teeth bright in a face too narrow, a man who smiled the way others spat. They argued about me as though I were a calf set out for trade. One said I'd fetch a price at the fort. Another thought a boy my age was more trouble than worth. Cole wanted to keep me a while, if only to see how far I'd break before I bent. Their voices rose and fell like a council of crows, each opinion dark but casual, as if my life were only another measure of coin. Through it all, Creed remained still, his gaze fixed not on me, but on the fire itself, as though he already saw the outcome and found no need to argue. The canyon walls carried sound too well, so that even whispers echoed, and as the men quarreled, I caught words not meant for me. "Blackwell will pay. A lot if the boy lasts. The fort needs proof the Wynn place is finished." Each sentence weighed heavier than the rope at my wrists. They hadn't only come to take me, they had come to send a message. My family's home, my sister's life, all of it was coin in someone else's ledger. When their talk paused, Cole crouched in front of me, the firelight twitching across his face. He dangled a strip of red ribbon between his fingers, swaying it close enough for me to smell the smoke woven into the threads. My stomach turned to ice. It was Clara's ribbon, the one she wore in her hair when chores demanded it out of her eyes. Cole tied it to his saddle with a flourish. "She'll come," he said softly, mocking. "And when she does, she'll find you waiting." His laughter crawled into my ears like insects, and though I wanted to shout, I bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood, because my silence was the last thing I owned. The fire burned lower, shadows thickening against the canyon walls. Some of the men lay back against their saddles, Others drifted toward sleep, but I could not rest. Every time my eyes closed, I saw Clara in the smoke of the cabin, screaming for me, her face cut with ash and grief. I tried to pray, but the words slipped from my mind like water through a broken cup. I tried to think of escape, but the ropes were too tight, the canyon too wide, the guards too watchful. I thought instead of what Clara would do, how she would carry her fear in silence and let it harden into resolve. That thought steadied me enough to keep breathing. It was then, in the edge of darkness, that I heard it. Not the mutter of men or the restless hooves of horses, but a voice low enough that I doubted my own ears. A whisper, close and sharp, that seemed to slip from the stone itself. "Stay awake, boy!" I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My eyes darted to the shadows beyond the fire. The guards had not moved. Creed sat as still as ever, his gaze steady on the dying flames. Only Cole stirred, turning in his sleep with a grunt, muttering a curse under his breath. I licked my cracked lips and strained to hear again, but the canyon gave me only silence, thick and suffocating. Still the words lingered, and the sound of them was nothing like the jeering voices of Creed's men. This voice carried patience, and something older than cruelty. It carried intent. My chest tightened with a rush of wild hope and deeper dread. If there was someone in the shadows, watching, waiting, then perhaps Clara was not as alone as I feared. Perhaps neither of us was. I forced my eyes wide against the pull of exhaustion, repeating the whisper in my mind until it became a vow. "Stay awake, boy. Because if I slept, I would wake only in chains too deep to break. Because if I slept, I might never see the face of the one who had spoken. Because if I slept, Clara's ribbon would hang from a saddle forever, proof not of her rescue, but of my failure." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the night. Creed lifted his head slightly, as if even in silence he had heard something the rest of us missed, and his eyes gleamed in the dark with a knowledge I could not bear to guess. My breath faltered, my heart stumbling against my ribs, and the canyon felt tighter, closer, as though it were listening to us all. I pulled against the ropes once more, feeling the burn slice deeper into my wrists, and though pain streaked through me, I welcomed it, because it kept me awake, because it reminded me that I was not yet finished, because somewhere beyond the circle of fire, a whisper had found me. The forest gave way to ridges that rose sharp and narrow, their faces cut by wind and time into shapes that looked like watching men. I followed Tyan Wikasa up the slope, my lungs burning, my skirt torn where briars caught me, and each step felt less like escape and more like a test, as if the land itself demanded proof I was meant to walk it. The air thinned, carrying the resinous scent of pine and the faint sour tang of smoke, not from my cabin, but from somewhere ahead, drifting against the morning light like a banner of warning. I tried to keep my eyes on the ground, afraid that if I looked too long at the sky, I'd see the whole world collapse into the ash I'd left behind. Tyan moved like part of the land, his boots finding stones I would never have trusted, his shoulders shifting with the balance of someone who had walked these heights since boyhood. He spoke little, and when he did, his words came in a rhythm that felt older than the trees. "Your step is too heavy," he told me without looking back. "The ground remembers weight." I flushed with anger, though I could not deny the truth. My clumsy movements scattered pebbles, broke twigs, left traces even a child could follow. My father had once praised me for being careful in the kitchen, for skimming milk without spilling. But here in this wild place, I was nothing but a loud intruder trailing grief. The sun climbed higher, beating down until sweat mixed with soot on my face. My legs ached, my feet blistered, yet I forced myself onward, because each stumble only sharpened the image of Silas bound and gagged, dragged into dust by men who saw him as coin. Tyan paused at a crest and lifted his hand, stilling me with a gesture so sharp it cut my breath. He pointed across the valley, where a faint column of smoke rose from the basin below, black against the pale sky. My heart lurched, certain it was them, certain Silas was somewhere beneath that plume. But Tyan shook his head slowly. "Not camp," he said. "Signal." The word tightened every muscle in me. I had never thought of smoke as language, but here it rose with purpose, deliberate in its shape. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice raw with thirst. He studied it a long moment, his face unreadable. "It says the path is not empty. It says someone waits." He turned to me then, his gaze steady, and added, "And it says we are late." I wanted to run, to crash down the slope, screaming Silas's name, but Tyen's hand closed around my arm, steady and firm. "Noise is death," he said. His eyes flicked to the trees around us, scanning shadows I could not read. Creed's men ride loud, but not all men do. The implication chilled me. There were others here, unseen, men who did not burn cabins, but watched them burn. My throat tightened. How many hunters circled us? How many eyes marked our every move? We pressed onward, cutting along the ridge, keeping to the stone where our footprints would not linger. The land shifted under us, gullies twisting like scars, and more than once I nearly slipped, catching myself on roots that bled dirt. Each time, Tyen steadied me with a grip that was neither cruel nor kind, only necessary. It unsettled me how easily I leaned into that grip, how natural it felt to let him bear some of my weight. And I wondered whether this was trust or merely exhaustion disguised as need. When we paused to drink from a trickle of water sliding between rocks, Tyen crouched low, cupping his hands. He drank without waste, without sound, and then gestured for me to do the same. The water was cold enough to ache in my teeth, carrying the taste of iron and pine, and I swallowed greedily until he stopped me with a word. "Enough!" I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, shame heating my face. "You drink like someone who believes there will always be more," he said. I bit back my retort because he was right. On the farm, water had always been there for the pumping. Out here, every swallow felt like a gamble. The valley opened wider, the smoke now a thick line unraveling into the sky. Tyen crouched low in the brush, his eyes fixed on the plume. "This trail belongs to Creed," he said, his tone heavy with memory. I have followed it before. His words carried no need for explanation, yet I felt their weight. This was not his first loss, not his first pursuit. I dared to ask, "What did he take from you?" For a long while he was silent, his gaze never leaving the horizon. Then finally he said, "My brother." The answer struck me like a stone, because grief was no longer mine alone. His eyes, usually so sharp and distant, softened for a moment, and I felt a kinship I had not sought but could not deny. He knew the hollow ache of watching family vanish into dust. He knew the helplessness that burned hotter than fire. And though he gave me no further detail, I understood that his brother had not returned. The silence between us deepened into something that was not emptiness but shared weight. We moved again as clouds gathered low, shadowing the hills. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen, and the smoke ahead blurred into the darkening sky. I stumbled once more, and Tyen caught me, steadying me without comment. My chest heaved with the effort of climbing, but I kept moving, because to stop was to imagine Silas alone, bound, hearing only laughter where his prayers should be. When we reached a narrow ledge, Tyen froze, one hand raised. I followed his gaze down into the basin below. Through the veil of trees, I saw it, tents, horses, men gathered around a fire that burned with cruel steadiness. My heart leapt to my throat. Was Silas there? Was this the end of our trail? But before I could speak, Tyen's voice cut low and sharp. "Not yet," he whispered, his eyes fixed not on the campfire but on the smoke itself. "This is not rest. This is lure." The words chilled me deeper than the wind. I crouched beside him, clutching Silas's scarf until my knuckles whitened, my breath shallow as the realization sank in. They were not only holding my brother, they were waiting for me. They dragged me from the post when the moon rose high, the rope yanking at my wrists until the skin split fresh and sticky against the coarse hemp. I stumbled as they pulled me toward the heart of the canyon where a fire blazed larger than any camp needed, its light climbing the sheer walls until even the shadows seemed trapped. The men ringed the flames, their faces flickering between menace and mockery, their laughter breaking in jagged bursts like glass underfoot. Creed sat apart from them on a flat rock, tall and unbending, his coat thrown back from his shoulders, as though the fire itself was his throne. He did not speak at first. He only studied the flames as though every answer he required was already hidden in the rising smoke. They forced me to my knees before him, grit grinding into torn skin, the heat pressing close enough to sear the air in my lungs. Cole Varick crouched at my side, his grin stretched thin, his hand resting on my shoulder, like a weight meant to remind me that he could snap bone if he chose. "What's the boy worth?" he asked, his voice sly, baiting, his eyes fixed on Creed. Ford'll pay silver enough. Or maybe we sell him piecemeal, one finger at a time, keep the girl chasing." The laughter that followed was thick and cruel, a sound that tried to make me smaller than the dirt beneath me. I clenched my jaw, refusing to give them the whimper they wanted, but fear crawled under my skin until even the steady beat of my heart felt like betrayal. I searched Creed's face for any hint of mercy, but his eyes were not cruel in the way Cole's were. They were colder, deeper, the eyes of a man who had measured cruelty and found it useful rather than entertaining. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, unhurried, the kind of voice that expected obedience without demand. "The boy stays," he said. "Blackwell has a price, and a Wynn name still rings in these hills." The men muttered approval, though some shifted as if uneasy. One spat into the fire, another asked why not take the coin from killing me quick and moving on. Creed lifted a hand, and silence dropped so fast it rang louder than the fire. "Dead boys do not bring silver here," he said. "Alive ones keep their sisters crawling, keep their neighbors fearful. Fear buys more than gold." His words settled heavy, and I felt the canyon itself lean closer to hear. Cole leaned into my ear, his breath sour with whiskey. "Hear that, boy? You're worth more scared than dead. Think of your sister. Think of her finding this camp. Think of her face when we show her what you've become." My stomach twisted, not from hunger but from rage so sharp it nearly blinded me. I wanted to shout, to strike, to do anything but kneel, but the ropes bit deeper, and the men's eyes glittered in the firelight, waiting for me to break. I swallowed hard, forcing silence into my mouth, because silence was the only weapon left. The council shifted, talk turning to roots, to signals, to men waiting at the fort with ledgers and rifles. I caught fragments, Blackwell's name again, the promise of barrels of powder, the mention of settlers, too afraid to resist once Creed's mark scarred enough land. My mind burned with questions, but none louder than the single name that had carried me through smoke. Clara. Was she alive? Did she even know where to look? I pictured her standing in the ashes, holding the scarf she'd mended for me last winter, her face streaked with soot and determination, and the thought cut sharper than the rope at my wrists. As the men argued, my eyes wandered past the fire to the canyon's edge. For an instant, I thought the flames tricked me, shadows shifting, but then I saw it. A flicker of movement where no man stood guard. My breath caught. There, half hidden against the stone, a shape clung to the darkness. Still but alive. My heart leapt before my mind dared believe it. Someone was watching. The firelight touched only the edge of a braid, the faint curve of a shoulder, nothing more. Yet I knew it was no illusion. I forced my gaze down before Cole could follow it, my pulse racing, the whisper from the night before echoing in my head. "Stay awake, boy." Now I understood. Whoever had spoken had not left me to despair. They were here, waiting, measuring, and if they were here, perhaps Clara was not as lost as I feared. Perhaps the canyon did not belong only to Creed's men after all. The fire roared higher as one of the captors threw a log into the flames, sparks leaping like stars escaping the earth. Creed lifted his eyes then, not at me but at the shadows beyond, as though even he felt the weight of another presence. For a breath too long, silence hung heavier than smoke, and the men shifted, uneasy. Creed's gaze swept the dark rim of the canyon, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the fire, dismissing whatever he had sensed, though the set of his shoulders betrayed the faintest tension. My heart hammered so hard it drowned the noise of their counsel. I knew then that my sister was closer than I had dared to hope. I did not know if she stood among the shadows, or if the figure was the same voice that had warned me before, but the knowledge was enough to keep me upright on my knees, enough to hold the scream inside my chest. When they shoved me back toward the post, binding me tighter than before, I did not resist. I lowered my head, hiding the tremor of my lips, and let them believe I was beaten. But inside, a fire hotter than theirs had taken root, stoked by the glimpse of that shadow on the canyon's edge. They thought I was their prize. They thought fear had already broken me. But I knew different now. Help had come. The only question left was whether it would reach me before Creed decided fear alone was not enough. The canyon stretched below like a wound in the earth, glowing with the fever of firelight. I lay belly down on the ridge beside Ty and Wikasa, my palms pressed into the dust, my breath caught in my throat as though even the air might betray us. From where we hid, I could see Silas bound to a post, the ropes bright against his wrists, his head lowered, but still moving, proof that he lived. Relief struck so sharply it hurt, but it lasted no longer than a heartbeat, for the sight of him surrounded by Creed's men filled me with a fear that settled into my bones like ice. Tyan shifted beside me, his presence steady, silent, his eyes fixed, not on Silas, but on the patterns of the camp. He counted their numbers without a word, his gaze sweeping the horses tied near the mouth of the canyon. The rifles stacked against a wagon, the men gathered too close to the flames for their own safety. He moved his hand across the dirt, tracing lines and shapes I did not understand until I realized he was drawing the canyon itself, mapping paths of escape or ambush. The sight of such calm focus unsettled me more than panic would have, for it meant he had studied this before, had walked into fire knowing how thin the chance of survival truly was. My hand clutched Silas's scarf until the threads bit my skin. I wanted to pray, to whisper words that might close the gap between me and my brother, but no prayer would carry across that fire without drawing every eye. Instead, I whispered to myself, a plea more to keep steady than to summon heaven, but Tyan's head turned slightly, and I felt the weight of his gaze. "Your God is not here," he murmured, so low the night itself seemed to carry the words rather than his lips. I stiffened, the rebuke stinging, but before I could answer, he added, "Here, the land decides, the fire listens, smoke remembers." His words pressed against everything I'd been taught, and anger rose, sharper for how much I feared he was right. "I can't forsake what I believe," I whispered, my throat tight. "Even if he is silent, he is still mine." For a moment, his eyes softened, the firelight below reflected in their depths, and he nodded once. "Then keep him in your heart," he said, "but do not put him in your steps. Out there!" He gestured toward the camp. "Your brother breathes or dies by silence, not prayer." The truth in it cut me, yet I could not deny it. We lay in silence for a time, the smoke from Creed's fire drifting upward, carrying the stench of charred meat and sweat. I could hear Colveric's laughter rise above the others, sharp and cruel, and the sound made me dig my nails into the dirt until my fingers ached. Tyan's hand brushed mine, not in comfort but in warning. "Anger makes noise," he said. His eyes narrowed on the camp. "Noise brings death." The night deepened, stars brightening overhead, the canyon holding the fire like a secret too large to keep. My body trembled from strain, every muscle locked between fear and determination. Tyan remained still, his breath even, his patience endless. At last he spoke again, his voice barely more than the wind. "Do you know why I help you?" I shook my head, unable to form the question aloud, though it burned within me. He turned his gaze away from the camp, into the dark ridges beyond. "Because Creed took my brother too, long before yours. I hunted, I fought, I found only graves." His jaw tightened, and the words fell like stones. "I will not let the same end find him." The weight of his confession bound us together in a way I had not expected. Our griefs were kin, our losses different branches of the same tree. I stared at him, seeing not only the stranger from the pines, but the shadow of someone who had carried my sorrow long before I knew it. For a fleeting moment, I felt the urge to trust, to lean into the strength he carried so effortlessly, but the thought frightened me. Trusting him meant trusting a path that walked in darkness, a path my faith had never shown me. A sound broke the fragile stillness. A horse shifting below, the clatter of a rifle butt against rock. My pulse surged as one of the guards lifted his head, his gaze scanning the rim of the canyon. He stepped closer to the shadows, his eyes narrowing. I pressed flat against the ground, barely daring to breathe, every heartbeat hammering like a drum against the earth. Tyan's hand slid to the knife at his belt, his body coiled but still, waiting. The guard's eyes swept past us once, twice, lingering on the ridge as though he sensed the weight of our presence. My lips moved in silent prayer, begging the earth to swallow us whole, begging the stars to blind him. The fire popped behind him, throwing sparks into the air, and his head turned toward the noise, distracted. He muttered and spat into the dirt before walking back toward the circle of men. Only when he was gone did I realize I had been holding my breath until pain clawed at my chest. Tyan relaxed a fraction, the knife still ready in his grip. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since the fire took my home, I felt something like resolve rising in me. Fear would not carry me forward. Prayer alone would not carry me forward. Only the shadow beside me and the choices I had yet to make could bring Silas back. The fire in the canyon roared higher, shadows leaping across the walls like spirits eager for blood. Silas bowed his head against the heat, his body swaying in the ropes. I bit down on my trembling lip, tasting copper, and forced myself to stay still. Beside me, Tyan whispered words I barely caught, words in a tongue I did not know, yet their rhythm calmed my shaking. I realized then that whether I called it prayer or chant, both of us sought the same thing, strength to face what waited below, but the guard's suspicion lingered in my mind, the image of his eyes sweeping the ridge. He had felt something, I was sure of it. And if he returned, if he found us, then all the silence in the world would not save us. The guard's boots scraped against stone, the sound louder to me than the crack of Creed's fire below. My body pressed flat into the dirt, every muscle aching with the strain of stillness. Tyan's hand brushed against my arm, a silent command. Do not move. The man climbed a few paces up the slope, his lantern swinging, its glow spilling into the brush where we lay. For an instant, the light painted my hand, and I drew it back so fast the grit cut my skin. My heart slammed against the earth as though it wanted to leap free and betray me. The guard paused, sniffing the air like a hound. He muttered something, words I couldn't catch, and crouched low, peering into the shadows. My lungs burned, desperate for breath. Tyan shifted beside me, so smooth I almost thought I imagined it. His knife flashed once in the lantern glow, a whisper of steel against night. The guard leaned closer, squinting. He was only a stride away when Tyan struck. The motion was silent, brutal, precise. The blade slid between ribs and the guard gasped, a wet, broken sound that never formed into a cry. Tyan caught him before his body hit the dirt, lowering him slow as if putting a child to bed. The lantern rolled, spilling its light across the brush, and in that sudden glow, I saw the man's face slacken, his eyes wide with the last shock of life. My stomach heaved, bile rising, but I forced it down. To make noise now was to die. When Tyan pulled the blade free, blood darkened the ground, seeping into the dust until the earth itself seemed to drink. He wiped the knife on the man's sleeve, then looked at me, not with apology, not with cruelty, but with the calm of someone who had seen too much death to question its necessity. Breath is loud, he whispered. Silence saves. His words cut deeper than the knife had, because in that moment, I realized the cost of every step I had chosen. The camp below stirred, a man calling out, asking where the guard had gone. My chest tightened. Tyan pressed a finger to his lips, then gestured for me to crawl back from the ledge. We moved slow, each shift of weight deliberate, the sound of our bodies lost in the chorus of fire and laughter below. My palms burned, my knees scraped raw, but I welcomed the pain. It anchored me, kept me from shattering under the image of the dead man's eyes. When we reached the shelter of a boulder, Tyan crouched low, his eyes scanning the camp. "They will notice soon," he said, voice like stone. "We must move." I wanted to argue, to beg for another glimpse of Silas, but my voice refused me. I thought of the lantern light on the guard's face, the sudden stillness of his body, and the words stuck like ash in my throat. The fire below crackled louder as another log collapsed, sparks swirling into the night sky. Men laughed again, their voices sharp, oblivious to the silence above them. For a moment it seemed we had escaped notice. My breath eased, and I dared to believe the danger had passed. Then Cole Varick's voice rose, mocking and cruel, cutting through the canyon. "Where's the watchman?" he called. "Has fear stolen his tongue?" Laughter followed, but Creed did not laugh. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping the shadows, and though the distance was great, I felt the weight of his eyes as if they pressed directly into my chest. Tyan tensed beside me, his knife still wet in his hand. His breath came slow, measured, but I knew he felt it too, the shift in the air, the awareness creeping through the camp. One wrong move now, one misplaced sound, and the canyon would erupt in gunfire. I pressed Silas's scarf to my face, the fabric damp with sweat and soot, and told myself to hold my breath, hold my fear, hold until the night itself swallowed us back into silence. But below, Creed's voice rang steady and low, carrying farther than any shout. "Find him," he said. The words froze the camp. Men rose, rifles in hand, spreading into the dark. Horses snorted, restless, the canyon filled with motion, every shadow alive with threat. Tyan touched my shoulder, urging me backward, deeper into the ridge, but my eyes locked on Silas. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping the canyon's edge, and for an instant, just an instant, our eyes met across the firelight. Hope surged in me so violently it nearly broke my silence. I bit my lip hard enough to draw blood, forcing the cry down, but the sight of him awake, alive, searching, nearly shattered me. I clutched the scarf until my knuckles whitened and whispered a prayer inside my chest. Not to God above, but to the earth beneath me. Let him hold on. Let him breathe. Let me reach him before Creed decides otherwise. Tyan pulled me back into shadow, his voice a breath against my ear. The hunt begins. The words struck cold as steel, and I knew he was right. The fire below was no longer just light and heat. It was bait. Creed had felt us, sensed us, and now the canyon would be scoured until eat the canyon. Erupted with motion the way a hive bursts when the stone strikes its heart. Men scrambled from the fire, rifles in hand, boots pounding against the rock as they fanned into the dark. Their shouts ricocheted off the walls, chasing one another into echoes that seemed to come from every direction at once. I pressed myself flat against the stone, the air burning in my throat, Silas's scarf clutched so tight my nails tore the fabric. Tyan crouched beside me, his body still, his eyes tracking each flare of torchlight below, calculating. His knife gleamed faint in the starlight, already slick from blood. He leaned close, his breath steady against my ear. "Now," he whispered, so quiet the wind almost carried it away. My heart lurched. Now meant leaving the safety of shadows. Now meant walking into the heart of Creed's fire. But Silas's bowed figure glowed in the firelight like a beacon, and I knew if I hesitated, the moment would pass, swallowed by the hunt that spread wider with each heartbeat. We slid down the slope, stone shifting beneath my hands, grit filling my nails. Every sound magnified by fear until I thought the earth itself betrayed me. The fire roared louder as we neared, its heat pressing against my face, its light clawing away the dark that had hidden us. I saw Creed's shape in the distance, still seated near the fire, his head turned as if listening to the land more than the men. Cole's voice rang sharp as he cursed the missing guard, his laughter brittle with suspicion. My chest tightened. I could not tell if they already knew we were here or if the night still cloaked us in mercy. Silas sagged against the post, his head hanging, his wrists raw where the rope cut into skin. My throat ached with the urge to call his name, but Tyan's hand closed around my arm, a grip like iron. He shook his head once, then moved forward with a predator's silence, each step measured, each breath part of the dark. I followed clumsily, my body trembling, my skirt catching on thorns until I feared the rip of fabric would betray us. But the fire's crack masked the noise, and we reached the edge of the circle before anyone turned. Tyan moved fast. His knife slid through the first rope before I realized his hand had lifted. He caught Silas beneath the arms as his body slumped, lowering him without a sound. My brother's eyes fluttered open, dazed, unfocused, but when they met mine, his lips parted in a broken gasp that was almost my name. Tears stung hot behind my eyes, but I pressed my hand over his mouth, begging silently for silence. His gaze sharpened, his breathing ragged, and at last he nodded. The ropes fell, one by one, until Silas sagged against me, too weak to stand. My arms wrapped around him, his weight dragging at me, my legs shaking beneath the burden. For a breath I thought we might make it, just slip into the dark, 3 shadows, swallowed by night. But then a shout split the air. One of Creed's men turned, rifle in hand, his eyes locking on us with terrible clarity. "Run!" Tyan hissed, shoving me toward the shadows. The man raised his rifle, the fire flashing against the barrel. Before the shot could come, Tyan leapt, a blur of motion, his knife arcing across the man's throat. The sound was brief, wet, final. The body crumpled beside the fire, its fall lost beneath the crackle of flames. But the silence that followed was worse. The camp had noticed. Shouts rang out, boots hammering against stone, rifles lifting in every direction. Tyan dragged us backward into shadow, his knife ready, his body a shield between us and the fire. I clung to Silas, his head buried against my shoulder, his breath shallow and hot. The world spun with chaos, the fire spitting sparks, men shouting names, the ring of steel against stone. I could taste blood in the air, iron sharp and undeniable. We ducked behind a wagon, the wood reeking of tar and hides. My chest heaved, every gasp loud as thunder in my ears. Tyan crouched close, his eyes fierce, his jaw tight. He leaned toward me, his voice sharp and certain even in the chaos. "You're free," he whispered, the same words he had spoken in the ashes of my home. But this time his gaze locked on mine with a weight that burned. "You're free, if you dare to take it." The knife pressed into my hand before I understood what he meant. Its hilt was slick, its blade warm from the blood it had already tasted. I froze, the weight of it anchoring me, my stomach twisting. I had prayed for deliverance, for rescue, for God's hand to lift me from grief. But now deliverance lay in my palm, sharp and merciless. Freedom was not being given, it was being demanded. Silas moaned weakly, his body heavy in my arms, his eyes begging me to carry him away. Shouts drew closer, rifles clattering, men's boots pounding toward the wagon. Tyan's gaze bore into me, unflinching. "Choose," he whispered. The world narrowed to the knife in my hand, the fire flickering against its edge, the sound of my brother's breathing, the thunder of boots closing in. Fear clawed at my chest, but beneath it a fierce, desperate resolve rose. The choice was mine, and whatever I did would mark me forever. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath steadying, my heart breaking into something harder. The shadows pressed closer, the fire flared, and the men's voices drew sharp as arrows. I knew then that whatever came next, prayer would not save me. Only the blade in my hand could. We vanished into its bones or were dragged into its flames. The night exploded into pursuit before we had taken 10 steps from the wagon. Shouts cracked like gunfire, rifles lifted, and torches swung through the canyon like angry stars torn loose from the sky. I stumbled under Silas's weight, his body weak against mine, his breath ragged in my ear. Tyan seized the reins of a horse tethered near the shadows, cutting its rope with one slash, and before I could protest, he hauled us up. Silas slung across the saddle before me. The animal reared, nostrils flaring, but Tyan's grip steadied it, his voice low and sharp in its ear until it obeyed. "Ride!" he hissed, and with a sharp crack of the reins, we bolted into the canyon mouth. The wind tore at my hair, grit stung my eyes, and every jolt of the horse rattled my bones. But the shouts behind grew louder still. Shots rang out, sparks flashing against the stone, and one bullet screamed past, close enough to tear fabric from my sleeve. Silas groaned, his hand clutching my arm, his voice a broken whisper. "Don't leave me." I pressed him closer, my heart burning with a promise I dared not break. Ahead, Tyan urged his own mount forward, his body low, every line of him bent toward escape. His braid whipped behind him, catching the torchlight as though it carried fire of its own. The canyon narrowed, walls rising higher, the sound of hooves magnified into thunder. Creed's riders followed hard, their torches casting long shadows that danced against the rock. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. My arms shook from holding Silas upright, yet I clung to him, each heartbeat a vow that I would not let go. Tyan glanced back once, his face grim, and signaled toward a side trail, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for horses. We veered, the animals scraping stone as they squeezed through, sparks leaping from their hooves. Behind us, curses rose, riders struggling to follow. For a moment, I believed we might outrun them. The trail opened onto a high ridge, where the wind screamed and the stars spread wide, cold and sharp. The horses pounded across the stone, breath steaming, the night vast around us. But Creed's men were relentless. Their torches bobbed like hunting eyes, closing the gap, their shouts rising with the rhythm of hooves. A shot cracked, and Tyan jerked in his saddle, his shoulder snapping back. He gritted his teeth, blood streaking his arm, yet he did not falter. He leaned forward, urging his horse faster, his voice low and fierce. "Go!" Fear clawed at me, threatening to drag me down, but resolve burned hotter. I bent low over Silas, whispering into his ear, though I wasn't sure if he heard me. Hold on, please. Just hold on. His body trembled, every breath shallow, but the faint pressure of his fingers against my arm told me he still clung to the thread of life. The ridge fell into a slope ahead, the path broken with loose rock, dangerous at speed. Tyan pointed toward it, his face pale in the starlight, but his eyes blazed with command. We plunged downward, the horses skidding, stones clattering into the void below. The world tilted, dust choking my lungs, but somehow the animals kept their feet. Behind us, one rider screamed as his horse lost footing, plunging into darkness. The chase thinned, but not enough. Creed's men pressed harder, their leader's shadow, riding tall among them, calm even in pursuit. I could feel his presence like a storm behind us, inevitable, patient. The slope leveled into scrub, and the ground grew softer, the smell of sage rising under the hooves. My arms throbbed with exhaustion, Silas's weight a stone dragging me under. I thought of stopping, of begging Tyan to take him while I faced whatever came, but before the words formed, Tyan's horse faltered, stumbling from blood loss. He righted it, his body swaying, his face twisted in pain. We burst into a dry wash where the moonlight pooled, pale and cold. Tyan pulled alongside me, his breath ragged, his hand pressed against his wound. His eyes met mine, fierce and unyielding. "If I fall," he said, his voice a rasp against the roar of hooves, "you do not stop." The words sliced through me. I shook my head, tears stinging. "I won't leave you." But he leaned closer, gripping my arm with surprising strength, forcing me to look at him. "Freedom takes sacrifice. Yours is not yet spent." Before I could answer, a shot cracked and his horse lurched. Tyan was thrown sideways, his body hitting the ground hard, rolling into the scrub. His cry was swallowed by the thunder of pursuit. My heart tore in two. I pulled at the reins, my body screaming to stop, to turn back, to lift him from the dust. Silas stirred weakly against me, his voice a hoarse plea. "Clara, don't!" His words trailed into nothing, his head falling limp against my chest. Behind us, Creed's riders closed in, their torches blazing, their shouts triumphant. Ahead lay only darkness, a trail uncertain, freedom no more than a whisper. My arms shook, torn between two weights, the brother I carried and the man I could not abandon. The knife Tyan had given me pressed cold against my side, a reminder of the choice I had yet to make. The horse thundered forward, my tears lost in the wind. My heart beat with a question I could not answer. Turn back for the man who had led me this far, or ride on with the brother I had sworn to save? Both choices felt like betrayal. Both choices felt like death. The night swallowed my cries as Tyan fell, his body tumbling into the scrub, his braid snapping like a whip before he struck the earth. My heart lurched with him, torn between the brother I clung to and the man who had guided me through shadows, who had carried my fear as if it were his own. The horse beneath me surged forward, driven by instinct, but every stride felt like betrayal, every beat of hooves a hammer pounding guilt deeper into my chest. Creed's men thundered close behind, their torches scattering sparks into the dark, their shouts rising with the rhythm of pursuit. I could not breathe for the weight of it. Silas sagged against me, his breath shallow, his skin clammy. His hand clutched weakly at my dress as though, even in his half-conscious state, he knew I wavered. Ahead, the wash narrowed into a cut of stone, a passage that promised escape if I did not falter. Behind, the ground where Tyan had fallen burned in my mind's eye. His words echoed louder than the chase. "Freedom takes sacrifice. Yours is not yet spent." The canyon walls pressed close, their jagged edges catching the torchlight, and I knew I had no more moments to waste. I reined the horse hard, wheeling it around in a spray of dust. Silas groaned, his voice breaking. "Clara! No!" But I was already pulling us back toward the dark where Tyan lay. The riders shouted in triumph, mistaking my turn for surrender, spurring their mounts harder. I clutched the knife in one hand, its weight steady now, no longer foreign. If freedom demanded blood, then I would pay. We burst from the wash into the open, the scrub tearing at the horse's legs. I saw him then. Tyan, half risen, his shoulder bleeding, his face pale but his eyes still sharp. He had drawn himself to one knee, knife in hand, waiting not for rescue but to face death with honor. When he saw me wheel back, fury flashed across his face, but behind it was something else, something that looked too much like pride. Creed's men bore down on us, rifles lifting, torches flaring. The world slowed, every sound stretched thin. The thud of hooves, the crack of leather, the ragged pull of Silas's breath. I slid from the saddle, dragging Silas with me, my knees striking hard, but I did not feel the pain. I threw my brother behind the horse, shoving him low, and turned to face the storm with the blade Tyan had given me. My hand shook, but my eyes did not waver. The first rider charged, Cole Varick's grin flashing through the torchlight. He raised his rifle, mocking even in pursuit. But before he could fire, Tyan rose with a roar, his knife arcing in the firelight. He struck the horse's flank, sending it crashing sideways. Cole toppled, his body snapping against the earth, his rifle clattering into the dust. The scream that tore from his throat was cut short as the horse rolled over him, silencing his laughter forever. Chaos ripped through the line. The riders faltered, horses rearing, torches whipping wild. Tyan staggered toward me, his breath ragged, his wound bleeding freely. He pressed his back against mine, our shoulders locking, his voice low and fierce. "Now you fight," he said. And I did. The blade in my hand found flesh, clumsy but desperate. I slashed at the rider who lunged from the left, the knife cutting deep enough to send him reeling. Another came, his rifle butt swinging, but Tyan caught it, twisting with the strength of a man who refused to fall. The torchlight painted every moment in fire and shadow, and the night itself seemed to tremble with the violence. I did not pray. I acted. And in every strike, every scream, I felt the truth. Freedom had never been mercy. It had always been a bargain. The riders broke one by one, their courage faltering as Creed's calm voice failed to steady them. I saw him at the edge of the chaos, tall and still, his gaze fixed not on Tyan but on me. His eyes burned with something more dangerous than rage, calculation. He did not raise his rifle. He only watched, as though weighing me against the fire he had lit at my cabin. Then, with a sharp tug of his reins, he turned his horse and vanished into the night, his promise of return carried on the wind. When the dust settled, silence fell heavy, broken only by the crackle of dying torches and the labored breaths of the living. Cole lay crushed, the others scattered or dead, and Creed gone into darkness. I turned, gasping, to find Tyan slumped against the horse, blood dark across his chest. I dropped the knife and caught him as he sagged, his weight heavy, his eyes already dimming. "Don't," I whispered, my tears hot against his face. "Don't leave us?" His lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "You chose," he murmured, his voice broken. "Now, you are free." His head fell against my shoulder, his breath fading into nothing. I held him until the stars blurred above me, until the night swallowed the last warmth from his body. Silas stirred weakly, reaching for me, his voice barely a breath. "Clara." I gathered him close, my tears falling onto both of them, brother and stranger, blood and shadow. The knife lay forgotten in the dirt, its blade still gleaming. By dawn, I had dug a shallow grave beneath the cottonwoods, marking it with stones and Silas's scarf tied to a branch. The wind moved him, and I whispered not of faith alone, but of gratitude, and who had carried us from fire, and even at the cost of his life. As the sun rose, Silas leaned, his body battered but alive. We turned our backs on the canyon, each step but lighter than. We walked toward our freedom bought in blood, our survival a debt we would never finish, and even now, steady. "You're free, but freedom has a price. The question that haunts me, whether I paid enough freedom at this cost. If this story, if you walked with me through fire and then I ask you, like this video, share it with us, subscribe to the channel. What would you have done? Would you have chosen the blade?